Okay, now we move on to the third part of this session. We're going to be looking at interactions and encounters. And in this first slide, I would like you to pause and think about these questions. So, what do we understand by interactions and encounters? Where they occur? Where, when, and for whom are encounters important? How we might define meaningful encounters? And do encounters have effects on attitudes to living with difference? So when thinking about encounters in everyday contexts, some are sustained encounters over time, others are more fleeting. Some involve voluntary contact with difference, others is involuntary. But despite the diversity contained with the idea of encounters in the everyday, the common thread is that these encounters occur in ordinary spaces and situations in the ebb and flow of daily life. And although the tradition of sociology itself is rich in this area, there is a pattern that can be identified as one that is often Eurocentric or colourblind, used to explore the application of encounters in the everyday context in terms of diversity and interaction amongst the culturally different is actually a very interesting area to explore. But there's a lack of attention often to the ways in which these questions might also be mitigated, not just by individuals who are different culturally, ethnically, but also by different immigration status. And there has been a shift in the literature in sociology and geography studies more recently since the 2000s towards understanding geographies of encounter. And I think what's really important here is to keep our focus on encounters and places and sites that are imbued with and shaped by inequalities. Jill Valentine's work is really fascinating in this regard, and really this study that she focuses on here from 2008 is an investigation into the nature of prejudice, and it addressed negative social attitudes towards a range of minority groups, so not just minority ethnic and migrant communities. There's a long tradition in sociological research from the 60s, and Valentine's work is part of this shift in social geography, human geography, critical geography studies, and sociology. Some of those names there are linked to readings that are on the list. And really what Valentine finds, of course, is that localities are sites of similarity and difference. Proximity, she finds, doesn't equate with mixing, and while different groups coexist and or even observe each other, nonetheless there's little actual mixing with different users who self-segregate in particular spaces, carving out their own territory. So there are processes of inclusion and exclusion, and these are underpinned by this idea of this being relational. So it's the opposition of one community to others or to other social entities. Some of the writing about new urban citizenship appears to be laced with a worrying, she argues, romanticisation of the urban encounter. And implicitly this reproduces a potentially naive assumption that contact with others, in inverted commas, necessarily translates into respect. She found the contrary, and that there is a paradoxical gap in studies that explore the geographies of encounter, so the sites and places of encounter, between values and practices, what people say they believe and what they do. And what she argues is we need to move beyond individual moments to effect more meaningful change. And by this she means contact that actually changes values and translates beyond the specifics of the individual moment, so into a more general positive respect for, rather than merely a tolerance of others. She found community-based narratives of injustice and victimhood, for example, that migrants are stealing jobs, that minority groups such as Muslims and lesbian and gay men, disabled people are receiving unfair cultural support or legal protection, and so on. So community-based narratives of injustice and victimhood. A position of parasitism was contrasted in these narratives with the perceived unacknowledged rights and contribution to society of the white majority community. So really it still comes down to being between them and us. Suzanne Wessendorf's work is interesting to compare here, and she develops the notion of commonplace diversity, referring to ethnic, religious and linguistic diversity being experienced as a normal part of social life by local residents. So she sees a practice of what she describes as civility towards diversity, where in public spaces people do not change their behaviour according to others' backgrounds, but in semi-public spaces such as associations and local institutions, conceptualised in her writing as parochial spaces, people's different backgrounds are acknowledged and sometimes talked about, but generally tolerated. She suggests this idea of an ethos of mixing, a general belief that people should mix, is paralleled by the acceptance of more separate lives regarding private relations, so the public and the private. And it is what she argues is part of the grammar of living in super diverse spaces that are shaped by political and public discourses about the positive effects of diversity. Valentine is critical of generalisations of power in the everyday encounter between culturally diverse people, and she says that this doesn't necessarily change hardened views which are discriminatory. Wesendorf would agree, but argues that it is in fact the absence of such encounters which enhances prejudice, so we need those encounters. But what Valentine would say in response is that encounters never take place in a space free from history, material conditions and power. And I think it would be really good for us to start to think about what this actually means. Okay, so some questions to reflect on here would be those knotty issues of inequalities that Valentine argues. And as Anouk Nayak asks, can commonplace diversity as an idea, can it help us understand these relations of power? And I think if you want to explore these questions, go back to these readings and think this through. Focusing on a specific group provides a space to trouble some of these uncritical understandings of the everyday and these notions of civility and ethos of mixing. It helps us rethink a little bit about whose everyday we're talking about, where it takes place, and what are those encounters. The chapter here, and a copy of which has been dropped in Moodle, explores the social lives of undocumented young people in the UK and transnationally. It is about their immigration status becoming a form of social prison. It's placed front and centre in virtually all of their social relationships. So any encounters they have come to be imbued by their immigration status, thus reproducing their outsiderness, their exclusion. They face challenges and interactions in everyday life. It constrains opportunities for building relationships, dictates where encounters happen, and inhibits the development of social networks. The issue of trust really surfaces in the accounts in this chapter, a fear of betrayal, a sense of guilt in interactions with others with whom they cannot be completely open. It shapes their relationships to space and mobility. Bloch, Sigona and Zetter talk about a map of safe or more or less accessible or forbidden places are fractured and discontinuous, this microgeography of undocumentedness. And I think this map of encounters is quite troubling. How sans-papiers, people without papers, experience sociality. Their immigration status dictates all of their interactions. And I think this idea of a microgeography is quite a compelling and convincing way to conceptualise the many physical, spatial and temporal complexities around undocumented lives for young people. They help us feel how precariousness breathes into every aspect of the fabric of their lives. And there are parallels, of course, with others who occupy these kind of liminal betwixt and between spaces. And I'd like to pause here and think about some of these questions. Can we claim beyond undocumentedness a microgeography of migranthood? And how might we be able to connect this up to the work of Valentine and Wesendorf? And does this open up other ways of thinking through the experiences of everyday borders and encounters? And we've talked about borders being put up, physical, symbolic, virtual, real. But another way of looking at this is what happens when a boundary is opened or removed. And Garner, and also Phil Hubbard's work, but Garner in specific, provides a really interesting analysis of this. So Steve Garner examines the discursive racialisation of asylum seekers by residents of Portishead, which is a small English town, and it's a process demonstrating the classed and race set of expressions of whiteness and how this comes to be located in a particular space. He looks at an analysis of residents' letters of objection to a government's request for planning permission to turn a building into an asylum processing centre. The border then of the English town is being removed by the arrival of others, even though this is with the arrival of a new boundary. So in a detention centre creates a boundary within a boundary. We see quite clearly the placing of race onto space by constructing a specific group as encroachers into a space where its members do not belong. So these letters talk about the whiteness of Portishead without explicitly talking about whiteness. And we see that then the bureaucratic category of the asylum seeker comes to be racialised. Right? Aspects of culture and social status serve as a basis for this racialisation. Right? It's not exclusively in terms of categorising with appearance, but also a more abstract process of attributing innate characteristics to all members of a given group. And what's interesting here is that through the racialisation of asylum seekers, the usually non-racialised whiteness of the British emerges as a salient racialised identity. So a border emerges between what comes to be constructed as bounded and homogenous groups and the potential upset caused by possible potential conjectural encounters in these sites. He analyses the language of the objection in three different ways. He looks at this idea of polluting bodies, the latent content analysis of the letters, note the proliferation of concerns over different kinds of pollution, dirt, noise, light, traffic, and suggests that the presence of asylum seekers could be read as everyday pollution because they are interpreted in this body of work as dangerous, unethical bodies defiling a presumed pure space. Racialisation of class, a sample group resident in and around the Vale, according to their addresses, is characterised as middle class due to the price of housing there. So there is a particular class aspect to this type of protest, of letter writing. And the idea of order disorder, the descent into chaos in which so-called behaviour of asylum seekers is speculated upon. It is expected to be detrimental to locals and the essence of their everyday order, and entails a variety of threats to Portishead's way of life due to outsiders' presence, including increased crime and physical danger, especially to children. And if you watch this short clip here, you'll see something similar happening. An instance in a village in Hungary where a local man wants to open up his hotel to house refugees. And an anti-migrant campaign takes root as villagers become terrified of the prospect of refugees living in their village. And I'd like you to think, once you watch this, about what overlaps you can identify with Garner and Hubbard's work. This is a clip here, and I'll post this on Moodle. And we see it elsewhere. This is a poster that was posted in Béziers in France on October 2016 in public spaces and bus shelters and billboards to campaign against the decision to relocate refugees from Calais. The poster says, "That's it, the migrants are coming." So look at the juxtaposition of the dark-skinned hooded men against the cathedral, the symbol of Christianity, the juxtaposition of race identities, of faith and religion. What is under threat is the cathedral, the Christianity, the essence of Frenchness. What are we to make of this? So we can see that this idea of polluting bodies, the prospect, the potential of encounters becomes very dangerous. So to summarise some of these ideas, where there are places of interactions and encounters, we've looked at them at a local level. Suzanne Hall's work looks at it at a street level. We've considered it happening in public services, in the workplace. It becomes embodied and fleshy. As Nyack argues, it's audible and spoken. We hear it, we feel it, we see it. It becomes inscribed onto place, and the language is heavily coded and sometimes very explicit when we talk about invading, horde, swarm, influx. to describe encounters that are real, virtual, and imagined. And I think it's also worth another pause here to consider the post-Brexit context. So in this final slide, come to the end of this discussion, and I'd like you to prepare some of these questions for in-class discussion together. The relationship between physical and symbolic bordering and interactions. Can an analysis of interactions help us with a conceptual vocabulary to think through binaries, to unthink and unpack those binaries, and to really critically engage with questions around power and social justice? I'd like to write up some notes for class and think about the limitations of these debates, as well as what they open up for us and how we think about everyday experiences.